worst weddings you've been to and what happened? I went to a dry wedding once, and when I say dry, I don't just mean they didn't serve booze. No, this thing was dry on every level you could think of, emotionally, socially, spiritually. It was the kind of wedding where you start wondering if maybe you missed the joke. Except there wasn't one. Just a long day filled with awkwardness, sweat, and a creeping sense of regret that I hadn't come up with an excuse not to go. But you live and learn. Now let me paint you a picture. It's the middle of summer, right in the heart of the South, where the heat doesn't just sit on you. It wraps around you like a blanket you didn't ask for. We're talking the kind of heat that makes you feel like you're wearing a wet sock on your whole body. Sticky, uncomfortable. That heavy air where breathing feels like sucking warm soup through a straw. And somehow, I get an invite to this wedding. A friend of a friend type situation, so I don't really know the couple all that well, which should have been my first red flag. The invite arrives in the mail, and right off the bat, something felt off. They had this strict dress code. Jackets required for men, and that's already a red flag in southern heat. But fine, whatever. I can sweat through a jacket if I have to. The kicker, though, was that women weren't allowed to show too much skin. I guess they didn't want anyone to feel too comfortable in their own clothes. But here's the real kicker. They banned linen. I mean, who bans linen in the South during summer? And that felt like a personal attack. It's the one breathable fabric we all rely on when the heat tries to melt your face off. But nope, not for this wedding. So the day arrives, and I already know this is going to be a marathon. The wedding is being held in a big white tent in the middle of an open field. No shade, nothing to hide from that blistering sun. I get out of my car, and I can already feel my shirt sticking to my back. You know that kind of sticky where you feel like your clothes are slowly becoming part of your skin? Yeah, that. I look around, and everyone else looks just as miserable. Men in heavy suits, women fanning themselves like they're trying to swat invisible flies. There's a collective sigh in the air, like we're all in this terrible, sweaty experience together. The ceremony starts, and I'm thinking, okay, let's just get through this. But no. No. It wasn't going to be that simple. The ceremony itself was nearly 2 hours long. Now, I've been to weddings where the ceremony is 15 minutes tops. Quick, efficient, say your vows, kiss the bride, and on to the party. But this was something else entirely. There were speeches, so many speeches. The bride gave one, which was fine, except it went on for about 20 minutes too long. The groom gave one, and it felt like he was just repeating what the bride said, but with fewer jokes. Then the minister started in with not one, but multiple speeches. And just when I thought we were done, he launched into what can only be described as a sermon on the virtues of commitment. I get it, marriage is a big deal. But there's a time and a place for everything, and this was neither. At this point, the air inside the tent was thick with a mix of heat, boredom, and sweat. I'm pretty sure I saw someone nodding off in the third row. And right when I thought we were wrapping up, because surely after all that it had to be over, the fathers of the bride and groom stood up. Great. More talking, right? Well, kind of. But they weren't there to talk. Oh no, they were there to sing. Gospels. Now, I have nothing against gospels, but these guys couldn't carry a tune if you handed it to them in a bucket. They tried, bless their hearts. But it was one of those moments where everyone kind of looks at each other like, is this really happening? And the worst part is, they didn't just sing one song. They sang two, back to back. I'm sitting there, drenched in sweat, wondering how much worse this day could possibly get. Turns out it could get worse, because right after the dads finished their performance, the best man decided it was his time to shine. Now, usually, the best man gives a speech, cracks a few jokes, maybe throws in an embarrassing story or two about the groom, and then we all move on. But no, this guy, who, by the way, I'm convinced had been waiting for this moment his entire life, pulled out an acoustic guitar. He was one of those guys, you know? The I bring my guitar everywhere, just in case type. He proceeds to strum his way through not one, not two, but 3 songs. And let me tell you, these weren't short songs. They were the kind of folk ballads that seemed to stretch on forever. 10 minutes in, I'm praying for the guitar strings to snap. They didn't. So there I was, stuck in this tent, watching what felt like a bad open mic night at a summer camp. The only thing missing was a campfire and some marshmallows. By the time the best man finally wrapped up his set, I wasn't sure if I had the strength left to make it through the rest of the day. But of course there was more. Always more. When the ceremony finally ended, and believe me, it felt like we'd been trapped in that sweltering tent for an eternity. I was ready to bolt for the nearest drink. I don't even mean alcohol at that point, just any kind of refreshment. But no, escape wasn't on the agenda. The minister wrapped up, the dads were done crooning their way through off-key gospels, and I was mentally preparing for the sweet release of the reception. That's when the real kicker came. Instead of ushering us to the reception hall like civilized human beings, they asked us, the guests, to stick around and help rearrange the tent. Yeah, you heard that right. The very same tent we had been roasting in for 2 hours during the ceremony. Apparently, they hadn't bothered to hire any staff to handle it. So, while the wedding party wandered off for their photo shoot down by the lake, the rest of us were left standing there, dripping sweat, tasked with turning the ceremony setup into a reception hall. I'm not even joking. We had to haul tables, fold up chairs, and set up new ones. It wasn't just some minor effort either. I'm talking full-on manual labor, in dress clothes, with not even a hint of a breeze to offer any relief from the oppressive southern heat. At that point, it wasn't a wedding anymore. It was some kind of bizarre endurance test, like they were seeing how much we could take before one of us passed out or staged a revolt. I looked around at the other guests, and we were all in the same boat. People I didn't know from Adam were giving me that "can you believe this" look. I caught a couple of guys in three-piece suits mopping sweat off their brows with cocktail napkins, trying to fold up chairs with one hand while keeping their dignity intact with the other. The whole thing felt surreal, like I'd wandered into some sort of social experiment where they strip away every ounce of joy you might have been holding onto and replace it with logistical nightmares. And speaking of nightmares, as we finally got the tables set up, we were hit with another delightful surprise. Seating was assigned. But there were no name cards. There wasn't even a seating chart. Instead, the wedding planner, a woman who looked as frazzled as the rest of us, but with the added pressure of making this circus, had to march table to table like some kind of drill sergeant. She had a clipboard in one hand, pointing out which table each guest was supposed to sit at, calling our names like we were kids waiting to get picked for dodgeball. It brought me back to middle school gym class. You know, when you're just hoping you don't get picked last. We'd been through the emotional ringer, we were sweating buckets, and now we were being placed like chess pieces in this odd, overplanned game. It was ridiculous. I was eventually assigned to a table near the back, which at first I thought was a relief. Less attention meant fewer awkward conversations, and I figured I'd just keep my head down and get through the night. Except it wasn't that simple. Oh no, of course not. The bride and groom had this brilliant idea that they would visit each table individually before anyone could go to the buffet. You know, to make it personal. On paper, I guess that sounds sweet, like they're really trying to connect with their guests. But in practice, it was an absolute disaster. They didn't just swing by for a quick hello either. They were taking photos with each group. And not just a couple of quick snapshots. No, they were striking poses, chit-chatting, and making sure each table had the perfect moment with them. Meanwhile, I was starving. I hadn't eaten since breakfast, and here we were, well into the afternoon. And I hadn't seen so much as a cracker. The bride and groom were taking their sweet time, going from table to table, smiling and laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. Meanwhile, I could practically hear my stomach growling. Each time they paused for another round of pictures or another long-winded speech about how thankful they were for everyone's support, my hunger only got worse. It's like being stranded in a desert and watching someone drink a bottle of water just out of reach. And then, finally, they made it to our table. But by that point, I wasn't even interested in small talk. I was eyeing the buffet like a predator sizing up its prey. When they left, we were finally released to get in line for food. At this point, I didn't care what they had. I just needed something to eat. But of course, because this wedding couldn't just endure normal bad luck, the food was the final nail in the coffin. They had gone on and on about how the groom and his new father-in-law had spent the day before smoking brisket for everyone. Now, I love barbecue as much as the next guy, and I've had some life-changing brisket in my time. This was not that. The problem was that the brisket had been sitting out in the heat for who knows how long. I don't care how skilled you are at smoking meat. Once it's been baking under the sun for a few hours, there's not much hope left. It was dry. I'm talking jerky dry. Each bite sucked the moisture right out of my mouth. It was like chewing on cardboard. The sides weren't any better. Mac and cheese that had clearly been sitting out for far too long, losing any semblance of creaminess it might have once had. The cheese was starting to congeal into this unappetizing, rubbery blob. Then there was the salad. Now, when you think of a summer salad, you picture something fresh. Maybe some crisp lettuce, maybe some tomatoes, cucumbers, something refreshing to balance out the heat. What we got was a sad pile of wilted greens that looked like they had been picked a week ago and left to fend for themselves. I'm not sure what kind of dressing they had, but it didn't help. At this point, I was just trying to make it through the meal. You know how you can tell yourself, just eat fast and you won't notice how bad it is? Yeah, well, that wasn't working either. I was half-heartedly poking at the brisket, wondering how this day had gone so far off the rails. I wasn't the only one either. I saw people at other tables exchanging looks of pure misery. We were all just trying to survive at this point. And here's the kicker. As we're all sitting there, chewing our dry barbecue and rubbery mac and cheese, the bride and groom decided to give another speech. Like we hadn't heard enough from them already. This time, they wanted to thank everyone for coming out and helping make their day so special. I nearly choked on my brisket when the groom mentioned how it was the best day of his life. Oh, and then there was the cake. I mean, you'd think after all the dry barbecue, the limp salad, and the rubbery mac and cheese, we'd at least get some dessert as a kind of sweet, merciful end to this marathon of suffering. But no, of course not. The cake was a disaster in its own right. They had set it up on a table just outside the tent, in the sun. Let me tell you, this was not the kind of day where you could leave anything outside for more than 5 minutes without it starting to melt. And yet, there it was. A massive, elaborately decorated wedding cake slowly collapsing under the weight of the heat. By the time we were allowed to cut into it, the thing looked like a melted ice cream cone at a July 4th picnic. You could see it sagging on one side, the frosting turning into this sad, droopy mess. I had to laugh, though. At that point, it was almost impressive how everything at this wedding seemed to go wrong. Like, if you were designing a wedding to torture people, this is what it would look like. But the cake? It wasn't just about how it looked. The taste was a whole other problem. Now, I don't claim to be a cake connoisseur, but I know what's supposed to be good, and this wasn't it. First of all, it was dry, again with the dryness. I don't know if they made the cake days in advance, or if the sun just sucked all the moisture out of it, but every bite felt like eating a mouthful of sugary sawdust. The frosting, which had once been some intricate design, now had the consistency of melted butter left out on a summer porch. The guests were polite, of course, trying to choke down a few bites for the sake of appearances, but you could see the disappointment on people's faces as they chewed. I tried to wash it down with a sip of sweet tea, but even that had been sitting out too long and tasted like warm syrup. At this point, I'm thinking to myself, okay, it's got to be over soon, right? We'd done the ceremony, we'd rearranged the tent, we'd suffered through the world's slowest buffet, and now we'd enjoyed some cake. It seemed like there was nothing left to do but maybe let loose a little, have some fun, and call it a night. But of course this wedding wasn't about fun. No, they had made that abundantly clear from the start. There was no dancing. Can you believe that? Not even the obligatory awkward first dance where the bride and groom shuffle around to some overplayed country song. Nope, nothing. No chance to move around. No chance to shake off the sweat and discomfort. Just more standing around, more forced conversations, more small talk about how lovely everything was, when really we were all silently counting down the minutes until we could leave. The lake, though, that's what really killed me. They had this gorgeous lake right there with a dock and this beautiful patio area. It was like a postcard, just begging for people to come down and relax, dip their toes in the water, maybe even take a few photos that didn't involve standing in a sweatbox. But guess what? We weren't allowed down there. Not even to take a breather. Nope. We were told very explicitly to stay inside the tent. Something about keeping the event focused. So there we were, trapped in this tent like prisoners, while that peaceful waterfront sat just out of reach. I kept sneaking glances at it, imagining what it would be like to just sit by the water with a cold drink, maybe catch a breeze and pretend for a few minutes that I wasn't at the worst wedding in history. But no. Instead, we were subjected to more speeches. And wouldn't you know it, the bride's father decided he hadn't quite said enough yet. Up he goes again, standing in front of us, mic in hand, ready to bless us with yet another endless monologue. By this point, I wasn't even paying attention to the words anymore. It was like listening to a lecture on a subject you couldn't care less about. I just remember thinking, how much longer is this guy going to go on? It felt like he was talking for hours, but what really stuck, what made me cringe so hard I thought I might implode, was the way he kept talking about his daughter. Or more accurately, not talking about his daughter. He mentioned her maybe twice in the entire speech, and both times it was in reference to how she would now be responsible for giving her new husband healthy sons. Can you believe that? his own daughter, and the only thing he could think to say about her was how she would be an excellent vessel for continuing the family line. Classy, right? The bride was standing there, smiling politely, but you could tell she was dying inside a little more with every word. The groom, on the other hand, looked like he was eating it up, nodding along as if being reminded that his wife's main job was now to pop out. Kids was exactly what he needed to hear on his wedding day. The speech dragged on, and I was just sitting there, staring at that lake again, wishing I could swim across it and escape to the other side. Maybe start a new life far away from this nightmare wedding. Every once in a while, I'd glance around the tent, and I could tell everyone else was feeling the same way. People were shifting in their seats, checking their phones, trying to sneak out for bathroom breaks that were really just excuses to go stand outside for a minute and cool off. But no matter what we did, we couldn't escape the fact that we were all stuck here together, sweating, bored out of our minds, and listening to yet another speech that seemed to have no end in sight. By the time the bride's father finally wrapped it up, I think we were all too exhausted to even clap. At that point, I'd hit my limit. I'd powered through the heat, the endless speeches, the awkward forced conversations, and that god-awful dry brisket. My suit, which had been halfway respectable when I arrived, was now clinging to me like a second skin, completely soaked through with sweat. Every part of me ached, my feet from standing too long, my stomach from trying to digest whatever that barbecue had turned into after baking in the sun, and my head from all the noise and speeches that just wouldn't stop. When our table finally got its turn at the buffet, after what felt like an eternity, I couldn't even enjoy it. The hunger I'd been nursing all day had hit the point where I just didn't care anymore. You ever get so hungry that food becomes less of a pleasure and more of a chore? That's where I was at. I was shoveling dry brisket and rubbery mac and cheese into my mouth like I was fulfilling some kind of basic survival need, not because it was good or enjoyable. It felt like an obligation. Every bite tasted like regret. I glanced at my +1, a buddy of mine who had somehow gotten roped into this fiasco with me, and we shared this silent understanding, like an unspoken agreement. We were done. No more speeches, no more sweating in this tent from hell, no more pretending we were having a good time. We needed out. I think we were just waiting for the slightest excuse to bail, and once our table had been released from buffet purgatory, we didn't need to think twice. We slipped out of that tent so fast, I half expected someone to chase us down, waving a clipboard and telling us we couldn't leave yet because the bride and groom hadn't taken their photos with us. But thankfully, no one seemed to notice, or if they did, they were probably thinking the same thing. We weren't the only ones desperate for an escape. As we made our way to the car, I could hear murmurs from other guests, the kind of hushed, miserable conversations you hear when people are plotting their exits. We didn't have much of a plan, other than just getting the hell out of there. I could have driven anywhere, as long as it wasn't that tent. We ended up at an Applebee's of all places. Nothing fancy, but after what we just endured, it felt like an oasis. The air conditioning hit us like a blessing from above, and I swear I could have cried right then and there. We slumped into a booth, exhausted, and just sat there for a minute, basking in the cool air and the relative peace of being away from the chaos. And here's the kicker. A dozen other guests from the wedding had the same idea. Scattered across the restaurant like battle-weary soldiers, all of us looked like we'd been through the same traumatic experience. People were still in their wedding clothes, ties loosened, jackets draped over chairs, just trying to recover from the day. At one point, I saw a woman at a nearby table actually cry when they brought her a margarita. I don't blame her. After the dry, sweet tea and warm lemonade they'd been serving at the wedding, a cold drink with alcohol probably felt like salvation. We spent the next hour or so decompressing, swapping horror stories with the other wedding refugees. It was like we'd survived something together. Strangers just a few hours before, now bonded over the shared misery of one of the most uncomfortable events of our lives. Every now and then, I'd glance around the room and catch someone shaking their head, as if still processing how bad the wedding had been. My buddy and I ordered burgers and beers, and I can tell you it was the best meal I'd had all day. Not that Applebee's is known for gourmet food or anything, but compared to what we just suffered through, it might as well have been a 5-star dining experience. And here's where it gets even better. From what I heard later, the reception dragged on for hours after we left. I guess the bride and groom had this grand plan where every guest would take turns sharing a memory they had with them. Can you imagine? After everything we'd been through, they still thought it'd be a good idea to make people stand up and give speeches. I'm beyond grateful we dodged that bullet. I can only imagine the awkwardness of watching people scramble to come up with something to say. I mean, half the guests barely knew them. What kind of memories were they expecting? I remember when you handed me the most uncomfortable wedding invite I've ever received. Yeah, no thanks. But it doesn't end there. A few weeks after the wedding, I got a thank you card in the mail. I'm flipping through the bills and junk, and there it is. A little white envelope from the happy couple. I almost didn't open it, but curiosity got the better of me. I figured maybe it'd give me a good laugh after everything that had gone down. And wouldn't you know it, they spelled my name wrong. After all that, I spent an entire day sweating, suffering through bad food, bad music, bad everything, and they couldn't even be bothered to spell my name right on the thank you card. I've been to some bad weddings in my time, but this one takes the cake, melting and all. It was one of the most exhausting, uncomfortable, and downright bizarre weddings I've ever attended. It felt less like a celebration and more like some twisted endurance challenge. And every now and then, when I'm at another event and things start to get a little awkward or the food's not great, I remind myself that it could always be worse. I could be back in that tent, sweating through my suit, listening to yet another speech that seemed to have no end in sight. But hey, at least the sweet tea was weak.